As noted earlier, when JP Morgan Sr. died, the Morgan banking empire went into JP Morgan Jr.'s name, which makes sense as he was running the operations by that point anyways. And we can see on the day that JP Morgan Sr. died, the announcement being made, no change in firm. The right side of the column is faded out of visibility, but it says, Mr. Morgan's death will mark no change in the firm, according to an announcement made at the office of JP Morgan and Company today. H.P. Davison, who made the announcement, said that the business would be conducted as heretofore, meaning the same as before, no change. And notice who made the announcement, H.P. Davison, who is Henry Pomeroy Davison, one of the six back in 1910 who drafted the plans for what would become the Federal Reserve. So, with JP Morgan Jr. now in charge of the Morgan banking empire, and World War I right around the corner, let's have a look at Britannica.com. And we see, during the first 3 years of World War I, he became the sole purchasing agent in the United States for the British and French governments, buying about $3 billion worth of military and other supplies from American firms on behalf of those countries. What this means is that for the first half of the war, until the United States entered the war, any and all trade for supplies and materials from the United States to the Allies had to go through JP Morgan. So American companies that dealt in munitions or weapons or clothing or raw materials such as steel or iron or brass or powders would have to deal through JP Morgan if they hoped to sell their merchandise to the Allies during the war. So let's have a look at how JP Morgan and Company achieved that deal. Now we're going to take a look at the munitions industry hearings that took place between 1934 and 1936. And I want to point out that these are like a continuation of the war expenditure hearings that took place right after the war in 1919 to 1921 that we had a small glimpse at earlier. Both investigations took a deep look into the causes and finances of World War I, and both were releasing multiple volumes as their investigations were going on. And between the two of them, there's over 20,000 pages of documents to go through, with information and financial figures that are truly astounding, and testimony from some of the highest figures in Wall Street, including JP Morgan Jr. So let's have a look at the munitions industry hearings, more commonly referred to as the Nye Committee, named after its chairman, Senator Gerald Nye, who's also pictured in the left in the background photo, which is a photo from the actual hearings as they took place. And as you can see, he's discussing something with JP Morgan Jr. And let's have a look. And here we're looking at part 26, with interviews conducted January 9th and 10th, 1936. And they're looking into World War financing and United States industrial expansion in 1915, specifically with JP Morgan and Company. So let's have a look at how JP Morgan Jr. cornered the market on trade during the first half of World War I. And note who was given testimony at the same time as JP Morgan Jr., that being Thomas W. Lamont, who was another partner at JP Morgan & Company, and Frank A. Vanderlip, who was another one that was at that meeting in 1910 at Jekyll Island that first came up with the drafting to create the Federal Reserve. So here we're looking at a memorandum regarding commercial agency agreements between the British and French governments and JP Morgan & Company. And this memorandum was drafted by JP Morgan & Company and sent to the Nye Committee on July 26, 1935. And they start out by talking about the problems and the conditions existing at the outbreak of the war, and go on to say, the partners of JP Morgan & Company, with this situation in mind, realized that by coordinating the chief purchases of the Allies in the United States through an American agency, both purchasers and sellers would be benefited, and a desirable business might be developed for the firm. So it was JP Morgan & Company that came up with the idea to begin with. And right below that we see, in November 1914, this subject was directly discussed by Mr. Henry P. Davison, a member of the firm, with Sir George Page and Mr. Basil P. Blackett, who were then in this country as representatives of the British Treasury. And down below that we see, an outline of an agency arrangement was then drafted by Mr. Davison and submitted a few days later at a meeting with the British Prime Minister, Asquith, and Mr. Lloyd George. The Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer stated that they were in favour of the proposed purchasing agency, and that the Secretary of War, Kitchener, was inclined the same way. The negotiation of the agreement was left to Sir George Gibb and Mr. Davison. toward the end of December 1914, the substance of the arrangement had been agreed to by them. And we see below that, the British authorities were desirous that similar agency agreements should be made by France and Russia with J.P. Morgan and Company in order to effect a general coordination of Allied purchasing in the United States. And here's a copy of the actual deal between J.P. Morgan and Company and the British government, which states, an agreement made the 15th day of January 1915 between His Majesty's Army Council and the Commissioners for executing the office of High Lord Admiral of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland, hereinafter called His Majesty's Government, on behalf of His Majesty of the one part, and Messrs. J.P. Morgan and Company of 23 Wall Street in the city and state of New York, USA, hereinafter called the commercial agents of the other part. And the first term states, the commercial agents will, as from the date of this agreement, place their services at the disposal of His Majesty's government for the purchase of such goods and supplies as they may be instructed to buy in the United States of America. And there's 2 full pages of these terms listed, but that's how J.P. Morgan Jr. became the sole purchasing agent for the United States for the first half of World War I. Now let's hear from J.P. Morgan Jr. himself about the deal. The committee and the general public are acquainted with the facts that for the British and French governments we ordered about $3 billion for materials of different sorts, they always having full knowledge of the details of the contract, and we always have indefinite authority to sign each individual contract as their agents. For our services during the life of the contract we were paid the commission of roughly 1%, which was stipulated, amounting to approximately $30 million. And supplies and materials weren't the only things that J.P. Morgan wanted to deal with the Allies in. Being a banking house, they would naturally want to get into dealing with loans as well. But as we can see, the chairman, who was Senator Nye, asked J.P. Morgan Jr. On August 15, 1914, the State Department informed J.P. Morgan and Company that loans by American bankers to belligerents were inconsistent with the true spirit of neutrality, did it not? I have before me here a copy of that letter from Bryan, on the stationery of the Department of State, Washington, and that would be William J. Bryan, then U.S. Secretary of State. And Senator Nye, the chairman, goes on to start reading that letter from Bryan to J.P. Morgan Jr., which stated, inquiry having been made as to the attitude of this government in case American bankers are asked to make loans to foreign governments during the war in Europe, the following announcement is made. There is no reason why loans should not be made to the governments of neutral nations, but in the judgment of this government, loans by American bankers to any foreign nation which is at war is inconsistent with the true spirit of neutrality. So, at that time, no loans allowed. But with the sinking of the Lusitania on May 7, 1915, followed by a month of arguing about what to do about it with U.S. President Wilson, U.S. Secretary of State William Bryan quit. And following his departure, loans were allowed to both sides of the war, which is something J.P. Morgan naturally jumped into right away. Which we can see here with Senator Clark saying, I call to your attention to a cable from Morgan in New York to Morgan in London, dated September 27, 1915, which I offer for the record with the appropriate number. That cable reads in part as follows. We agreed with the Commission Saturday to endeavor to form an underwriting syndicate for $500 million, 5-year 5% joint notes. And that would be the first of many loans to follow, to both sides of the war. And we can see Senator Clark again asking about some of those other loans, saying the so-called French loan to which we referred the other day, and the German loan of $20 million came in under the differentiation of loans and credits to which we referred the other day, did they not? So how about that? They also loaned Germany $20 million. And about the so-called French loan, as they put it, Mr. Brown asked J.P. Morgan Jr., as a matter of actual fact, was it not a loan to the French government through Rothschild for Earache? To which J.P. Morgan Jr. responded, Rothschild were responsible for the loan. Mr. Brown again asks, but the French government guaranteed Rothschild? And J.P. Morgan Jr. answers, that may be. We did not know anything about that. That is their business.
Good answer. Good answer. Good answer. A little hypocritical, but
As J.P. Morgan was giving testimony, we see at the same time in the newspapers headlines like this. Probe shows how Morgan's business rose 1,465% when war started. The Senate Munitions Inquiry showed today that American war materials contracts handled by J.P. Morgan for the Allies zoomed upward 1,465% in a 3-year period when the United States munitions industry was being developed, quote, to meet the Allied needs, end quote. At the same time, the committee brought out all private loans, totaling about $1.5 billion, all lent to Britain and France, for the foreign nations at war which J.P. Morgan and Company managed, were repaid, with the exception of Russia's. Similar loans to the nations by the United States government never have been refunded. And this was by 1936. When the United States entered the war in 1917, they had lent the Allies, or the Entente, over $2 billion, while at the same time only lending Germany, or the Central Powers, about $27 million. And we saw that $20 million of that amount went through J.P. Morgan. The newspaper article also goes on to mention this. The committee, reviewing events leading to American entry in the World War to provide background for new neutrality legislation, laid emphasis on the development of the munitions exports from practically nothing before the war to huge trade in 1917. And that's something to keep in mind, as we're going to visit that later on. But something else to keep in mind is that J.P. Morgan wasn't just making a killing being the sole purchasing agent for supplies and materials and making loans. Remember, he owned other businesses, such as U.S. Steel, and let's have a look at how they did once World War I erupted. The United States Steel Corporation is shown to have had the following profit record. In 1914, it made 3% on its investment. In 1915, this had increased to 10%. In 1916, 23%. In 1917, 35%. And in 1918, 29%. The gross adjusted earnings as reported for the years 1915 through 1918, respectively, were as follows. $131,223,000 in 1915, $348,254,000 in 1916, and a whopping $585,494,000 in 1917. And of course US Steel's numbers would explode like that, considering J.P. Morgan was the one who was deciding who got what contracts. And naturally, his buddies, the other kings of Wall Street, would also see their numbers rise dramatically as well. For example, let's have a look at the DuPonts. We can see that their assets in the years leading up to the war were around 80 million or so, with the exception of the one year in 1913 where it dipped down to 74 million. And then when the war exploded, so did the numbers for DuPont. And have a look at the numbers after the war and going into the Great Depression. And Senator Nye asked Pierre S. DuPont, "From this statement, Mr. DuPont, it is very evident that your assets were considerably larger after the war than they were during the war. What is the conclusion to be drawn?" And Pierre S. DuPont, ever the mathematician, responds, "It is increased by the profits made as set forth yesterday of about $260 million. Now let's have a look at Remington Arms and the Rockefellers. And here they give us a history of Remington. This company, which will be hereinafter referred to as the Remington Company, was incorporated in January 1916. The arms and ammunition business done under that name, however, was one of the largest and oldest of its kind in the United States, having been established by Marcellus Hartley, the grandfather of Mr. M. H. Dodge, in 1854, and M. H. Dodge is Marcellus Hartley Dodge. For several years prior to 1916, it had been conducted by Mr. Dodge individually, under the name of Remington Arms Union Metallic Cartridge Company as a registered trade name. Most of the manufacturing was done through corporations, the stock of which was owned by Mr. Dodge, the most important being the Remington Arms and Ammunition Company, engaged in the manufacture of Remington rifles and shotguns, and the Union Metallic Cartridge Company, manufacturing UMC cartridges and shells. And I want to point out that I'm not exactly sure what they mean when they state Remington Arms as having been established by Marcellus Hartley in 1864. And perhaps they're meaning that's when Marcellus Hartley first established business relations with Remington, as that would then make sense. Remington Arms was founded by Eli Faylout Remington as E. Remington in 1816, then became E. Remington and Sons, and so on. Marcellus Hartley was a founding partner of Schuyler, Hartley and Graham, founded in 1854. And by 1864, during the Civil War, they were a huge supplier of guns, rifles, uniforms, and other military equipment for the Union. And it's quite possible, and even probable, by that point that Marcellus Hartley was doing business with Remington. After the Civil War, in December of 1865, Marcellus Hartley and his partners bought the remnants of Crittenden and Tibble's manufacturing and C.D. Leet and Company. They put the resources and equipment of the two together, and in March of 1866, founded the Union Metallic Cartridge and Cap Company, soon dropping the cap part of the name in 1867. And we see solid business connections between Marcellus Hartley and Remington in 1871, with Schuyler, Hartley and Graham acting as agents for Remington, one of the many munitions manufacturers that they would be agents for, including their own companies. A series of events and bad management led to hard times for Remington in the 1880s, and by early 1886 Remington Arms would find itself going into receivership. A year later, in February of 1887, partner Jacob Rutson Schuyler dies, and the company now becomes Hartley and Graham Arms and Ammunition. A year after that, in February of 1888, the courts ordered Remington Arms to be sold at auction. And a month later, in March of 1888, Hartley and Graham, together with Winchester Arms, buy Remington Arms. Winchester would sell its half-share interest in Remington Arms to Hartley and Graham in 1896, making them the sole owners of Remington Arms at that point. On December 18, 1899, partner Malcolm Graham died, leaving Marcellus Hartley as the only surviving partner, and the company name changes to the M. Hartley Company. And Marcellus Hartley becomes the sole owner of that company, as well as Remington Arms, the Union Metallic Cartridge Company, and the Bridgeport Gun Implement Company. Now we'll go back a little bit to May 6, 1880, and Marcellus Hartley's oldest daughter, Emma, married Norman White Dodge, and 10 months later, on February 28, 1881, she gave birth to Marcellus Hartley Dodge. And within a week, on March 3, 1881, Emma would die from childbirth complications, and the newborn baby Marcellus Hartley Dodge would be taken in and raised by his grandfather Marcellus Hartley and his wife Frances. Now fast forward to when Marcellus Hartley died on January 8, 1902. His grandson Marcellus Hartley Dodge, at the age of 20, inherited everything. And unlike his grandfather Marcellus Hartley, who liked to keep the businesses autonomous from each other and operating independently, Marcellus Hartley Dodge consolidated it all and created the Remington Arms Union Metallic Cartridge Company. And that is the entity we're looking at in the munitions industry hearings. Now, by 1916, with the war still raging on in Europe, Marcellus Hartley Dodge would need loans to expand the business, borrowing about $13 million, with $4 million coming from William Rockefeller, his father-in-law. Yep, that's where the Rockefellers come in. Marcellus Hartley Dodge got married to William Rockefeller's daughter, Geraldine Rockefeller, in 1907. So, after securing the loans, we see in 1916, as a temporary measure, a committee of creditors consisting of the Guarantee Company, the City Company, and Mr. Rockefeller was formed to take charge of the business, and Mr. Dodge turned over to them control of the Remington Company by giving them 56% of its outstanding stock. So not only is Marcellus Hartley Dodge married into the Rockefeller family, but now William Rockefeller owns 18.6% of the company. Combined with Marcellus Hartley's 44%, they control a majority with 62% of Remington Arms. And here's yet another high-up connection, Samuel Pryor. In September 1913, a quiet, unassuming businessman, Samuel Sam Fraser Pryor, arrived in Greenwich to start a new career operating his family from their life near St. Louis, Missouri. Sam's new employer, the family of William Rockefeller, was already established in Greenwich and famous worldwide for its wealth. In his new position as general manager and vice president of Remington Arms Union Metallic Cartridges Company, Sam would report to two bosses, William's second son, Percy A. Rockefeller, the young head of the family business, and William's son-in-law, Marcellus Hartley Dodge. And check this out, going back to the munitions industry hearings. Here's a letter from Samuel Pryor dated May 7th, 1915, going to J.P. Morgan, who was the sole purchasing agent at this point. And he's asking J.P. Morgan to try and get the British War Office to cancel rifle orders that were going out to competitors, saying, "It is of very great importance for you to request the British War Office to cancel an order for 400,000 Lee Enfield rifles, as it is being peddled among all the small rifle manufacturers." And he further says that it would be impossible for any of them to successfully manufacture the rifle. And there's quite a few examples of letters like this from Samuel Pryor to J.P. Morgan and Company, which can be seen in that Remington in World War I received the majority of Allied rifle contracts, including 8 that were awarded in 1914 and 1915. So like I say, with J.P. Morgan as the sole purchasing agent for the Allies, the Kings of Wall Street were making a killing during the first few years of World War I. And it's pretty interesting that just a few short years earlier, all these guys were under fire from the US government using the Sherman Antitrust Act. And yet they managed to get the Federal Reserve up and running just in time for World War I, and position themselves to dominate trade and rake in hundreds of millions of dollars as millions of people across Europe were being slaughtered. And things were just getting started.